Assalamualaikum. Welcome back to the Eon podcast. We are joined here today by Professor Sher Ali, Tareen, who is a professor of Islamic studies. I'm sure you guys already know who he is. You've seen him on popular podcasts like Blogging Theology. It's a very popular podcast in Pakistan as well. You might be surprised to hear. Professor Sher Ali Tareen is currently teaching at the Franklin and Marshall School of Public Policy.
नहीं वो अलग है फ्रैंकलिन मार्शल कॉलेज एंड करंटली आई एम एट द इंस्टीट्यूट फॉर एडवांस्ड स्टडीज
Sorry, you're at the Institute for Advanced Studies, and this is a year-long fellowship. Chair Tareen Saab is very famous for his criticism of uh, the enlightened moderation project in Pakistan, and I thought that we should focus on the Musharraf era policies and their results that we're experiencing in 2024. It's been, I think, would you agree we're living in General Pervez Musharraf's worst nightmare? And he couldn't even imagine what he was producing in terms of policy making.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much, Sanaullah, and Saad Bhai for inviting me.
Amanullah.
Amanullah, sorry. Amanullah and Saad Bhai for inviting me to your podcast, and I wish you all the best. This is a really great venue, and it's really heartening to see this kind of interest in academic matters, and I think your podcast is a great medium to reach wider audiences. This is much needed, and it's much needed to intervene in the public sphere with viewpoints that don't align with a certain liberal secular fundamentalism, which unfortunately tends to be the main kind of public media, both in India and in Pakistan. So this is a great venue, and I wish you all the best for it. To answer your question, in some ways, yes. The main sort of problem, we can begin with this category that you just talked about, enlightened moderation, or this idea of moderation. So, this kind of a concept, of course, has a much longer history. It comes all the way from, 18th, 19th century Western Orientalism and Orientalist sort of discourses, and really the whole project of colonialism, whereby the whole project, of course, has always been about distinguishing good and bad Muslims. And the definition of goodness or badness most often corresponds with a certain liberal secular vision of what is good religion and what is bad religion. And underlying, at the crux of this whole question is a certain assumption, a secular assumption. And that secular assumption is that religion as a category of life, religion as a phenomenon, is one that if it is not properly moderated, hence the word moderation, it will always spill over into violence. So that is the underlying liberal secular assumption that really underlies the whole project of Orientalism, the project of colonialism, and then more recently, these kinds of modern state projects. And there are many examples, Musharraf in Pakistan, many other politicians and thinkers, quote unquote, in different parts of the world. So the underlying assumption there is that there are these two spheres of life, politics and religion. Politics is a sphere of rationality, of rational argument, deliberation, logic, and so on. And then religion then is a sphere which is marked by irrationality, superstition, inherently violent if not properly moderated. So notice that integral to the very category of moderation is an underlying assumption of this liberal secular bifurcation between politics and religion, whereby the political sphere, as violent as it can be, I mean, the whole project of colonialism in the British state was incredibly violent. Currently, there is no equivalent, there is no match to the violence of the American nation state, the kind of imperial American nation state, one should say. And similarly, in all contexts, the ability, the capacity, and the execution of the modern state's violence is of a much greater scale, is of much greater scale of horrifying violence and damage to humanity than any kind of non-state actors. But still, it's the religious, sphere and religious thought and religious scholars who need to be moderated. And this is not in some ways to sort of romanticize or to glorify, religious scholars, actors. There can be many critiques, of course, in terms of that tradition as well. But I just want us to take a step back and notice that the very word enlightened moderation is indebted, is really comes from this longer 19th century history of Orientalism and colonialism, which is then taken up by these neo-colonialist kinds of actors like Musharraf and other many actors who uncritically accept this liberal secular proposition that there is an underlying bifurcation between the non-violent political sphere and then the violent religious sphere, which is absolutely untenable, both empirically and conceptually. The last thing I would say, Amanullah, on this question of moderation is that even if you look at the etymology of this word, moderation, which comes from the Latin moderare, and the Latin word moderare, from which we get the English word moderation, basically means to control, to domesticate, to tame any kind of life. So the whole idea here is that you have the liberal secular state, which will control, which will domesticate, which will moderate this other sphere of life called religion, while at the same time perpetuating the kinds of violence that are unprecedented in terms of scale, in terms of scope, and in terms of execution. So when we critique these kinds of words, moderation, we really need to stay attuned to this longer history and this underlying liberal secular assumption that authorizes things like, in this case, for example, you have a guy who's talking about enlightened moderation, while at the same time he's given a free pass to the US state to conduct drone attacks in the border areas and with all kinds of horrific violence that was committed, of course, in the 2000s and continues to be even until today under various, US administrations. So we really need to get at this underlying liberal secular assumption because without critiquing this underlying liberal secular assumption about this distinction between the liberal sphere of politics and the illiberal sphere of religion, we will not be able to critique the whole project of colonialism. Decolonial thinking, decolonial politics is impossible without a critique of liberal secular power. Because integral to the whole project of colonialism was this secular moderation of religion, whereby goodness and badness, good religion and bad religion, good Islam and bad Islam, always corresponds to a certain Western liberal notion of what is good and what is bad.
Right, and the axiom on this, on which all of this rests, is the monopoly over violence. Your whole thesis, as I've understood it, is that the monopoly over violence is, as understood by the average public and by the intelligentsia in this case, is that the monopoly of violence, when in the hands of the state, automatically make it a political good, and in the hands of non-state actors, automatically make it a political wrong or an ill or an evil, and puts it in the category of the religiously fanatic or zealous violence that one would. I think it's a knee-jerk reaction now, and for the sake of the audience, I would like to provide some context that during the Musharraf era, not only was entertainment media and news media totally geared towards creating the archetype of the mullah or the evil Maulvi or the violent Maulvi or the extreme Maulvi, and to create and distinguish between good, and they did this through archetypes of good Maulvi versus bad Maulvi. I don't know if you remember the TV programs where they would make good guy Maulvis debate the bad guy Maulvis, and they would sometimes make mullahs sit in front of women intellectuals or thinkers or liberal, or feminist authors or these kinds of characters. And from entertainment, from news media all the way into entertainment media, we had things like Khuda Ke Liye, which is a very popular movie depicting the war on terror from the perspective of a naive, a confused upper middle class boy from Pakistan, and you had all of these things in media going on. Do you think that the idea or the illusion of the monopoly of violence has been broken with the Imran Khan phenomenon and the 9th May phenomenon? That illusion in a lot of people's heads has been broken, that the state's monopoly of violence might not be a fair assumption from the get-go.
No, you're making a very important point, Amanullah. This idea of the state's the monopoly over violence and the problem of this assumption. I just want to speak a little bit about that and then come to the more recent Pakistani context in a little bit.
Right, sir.
This is such an important point. And this point, for those of your English readers and listeners, is made perhaps in the most succinct, convincing, and very direct way by this famous scholar, Talal Assad, of course, son of the famous Muhammad Assad, who's written a lot, Talal Assad, on anthropology of Islam, and as perhaps is the most important scholar of religion and Islam today. He has this book that he published in 2007 called On Suicide Bombing. And it's a very short but very direct and excellent book. And the whole point of that book was that, this whole idea of the, again, the dichotomy between politics and violence. This idea that ultimately um, uh, violence, which is perpetuated by the modern state, has some kind of political ends or has some kind of political goals. But the violence committed by non-state actors can never be properly political. It will always be fanatical. And it can always be traced back to quote-unquote religious motivations. So the whole point of Talal Assad's book was that when we make the assumption that you have some kind of violence committed by an actor, a Muslim actor, say, in a context like Palestine, the immediate reaction is that this was done because of religious fanaticism. This was done because this actor could not control, his or her religious passions, which spilled over into violence. And in order to control that violence, then you have the liberal state, the Israeli state or the US state that has to come together and try to control and tame and moderate that violence. And that violence will be in the sphere of politics. And even if there is some collateral damage, or there is, death and suffering caused by state violence, that is justified because their intention, their motivation was not that of inherent violence, but violence of compulsion, that they were compelled to conduct that kind of violence. Now, Talal Assad's main argument was that this assumption that you can trace back the violence of Muslim actors to religious motivations, quote unquote, operates on the secular assumption that religious motivations, or this thing called religion and religious motivations, can be separated as a distinct sphere of life, as a distinct form of knowledge, a distinct phenomenon, separated from all other phenomena like politics, sociology, economics, whatever else, that religious motivations really motivated this person to commit violence. And Talal Assad raises a very interesting question of why cannot the violence committed by a Muslim actor, say a suicide bomber, why can that also not be complicated? Why can that also not have multiple factors at play in terms of why the suicide bomber did what he or she did? That cannot be reduced to quote unquote religious motivation. And just to be clear, his argument is not justify or to rationalize any kind of violence, but he's asking the question of why is it that when it comes to state violence, even though in terms of its scale and in terms of its execution, it was of a much, much higher level. And it always has been, and especially in the context of Palestine, which is the main context of that book. And I think that book, of any book, is the most relevant and significant today when we're seeing in lifetime streaming why the genocide of a modern state, although it is way more horrific than what any other non-state actor has ever done, but it is being seen as some kind of, in the light of political,
I mean, to play devil's advocate for a second, the
powers.
argument that they would make, I would like to play devil's advocate for a second.
Yeah,
The argument
sure.
that they would make is that that is a consequence of technological advancement. That there is a certain amount of economic accumulation or financial accumulation at the level of the state, and that leads to technological advancement in terms of military apparatus or armaments or ordnance. And that is why the scope and scale of the violence that the state perpetuates is much greater as opposed to non-state actors. And then they would argue the slippery slope, saying, thus, if these religious nut jobs or these religious fanatics get control of the state, they would perpetuate a violence even worse than our violence. So in a long-term sort of subconscious way, they are arguing the lesser evil of the current secular liberal nation-state paradigm being violent. But the classical example of the husband who beats his wife, I hate you, but I hate you because I love you. That kind of an argument, that's what they're making essentially. And they would argue that these non-state religious fundamentalist actors, because whose passions have spilled over from the personal level into the realm of the violent, just if they were given access to that military apparatus, they would do the same, if not worse than us. That is the argument that they do present and would present to your argument as a counter argument.
Right. Well, I mean, the reply to that would be that then, drop the whole kind of pretense
The facade.
of some kind of civilizational progress or being on the, drop the whole pretense of a liberal secular vision of the world, of rationality and so on, and say that, look, this is a world marked by intense violence on all sides. We are as bestial as anyone else, and trust us that we might be a little less bestial, that if we have killed 5,000 babies and committed all kinds of sexual violence and the kind of horrifying violence that cannot even be stated in words, that the other beast might do something even more bestial. So let's then have that discourse and drop the whole pretense of a liberal secular vision of the world of
of a
progress.
civilized society. I just drop the
Yeah,
pretense of a
exactly. So
civilized society.
let's drop the whole language of a civilizational mission and so on, and then fine, we can have a properly unmasked debate on this question. But to come back to the way that you ended your previous question, Amanullah, on the question of Pakistan and violence and so on. First of all, one has to really make it clear, and I don't want to make things difficult for you stationed in Pakistan, but let's make it very, very clear that
They can't get more difficult. Don't worry. We've had our share of troubles with YouTube and with where we are. Don't worry.
But let's make it very clear that the whole war on terror that in some ways continues until today, its after effects, and in some ways it's come back with a greater force. And it would be impossible without this kind of a collusion between this imperial nation state, the US nation state, and its other abettors and its primarily its mercenaries, like the Pakistani military. And it is a classic case of how a liberal secular narrative, the Musharraf narrative of enlightened moderation and so on, renders some populations as less human than others. And in the Pakistani case, of course, that is the tribal areas and other sort of pockets of populations, their inhumanity in the eyes of people like Musharraf and the military elite is sustained by and is made possible by the larger US imperial power and the US imperial narrative that some lives matter more than other lives. So if this plays out on a grand scale in theaters like Palestine, it also plays out on other theaters such as the Pakistani theaters, such as populations in the tribal areas. But the underlying logic is exactly the same, whereby there it is the question of good and bad Muslim actors. Here it is the question of good and bad, Taliban, good and bad Pathan actors, and so on. It's the same inherent logic that as long as
I love how you resisted for like a full 20 minutes to use the term the good Taliban, bad Taliban analogy. If anyone who's lived in Pakistan, they know about the good Taliban, bad Taliban debate that has marked, I think, the last 20 years in Pakistani discourse, a significant amount of Pakistani discourse in politics. But underlying that sort of argument or that sort of narrative is the acceptability of the humanity of the tribal people, of the people of the tribal belts in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa or in Balochistan, and the sort of the prestige of the trick is we declare via a centralized state authority who is human enough to be accepted into the, as we would say, Qaumi Dhara, into the national sort of blanket of acceptability or safety.
Yeah, absolutely. And the main paradox here, Amanullah, that we should not lose sight of is that the more fragile that the state perceives itself in terms of its sovereignty, the more fragile, the more violent it gets. And that is exactly what is happening in Gaza as well. That the more the violence becomes horrifying, the more it is a symptom of, the more it is a marker of the fragility of the state's sovereign power. But that fragility also leads to this kind of reactive violence that can be, ever more horrifying. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing in Pakistan as well. That the more the state feels fragile, insecure about its these kinds of narratives, about keeping together the fiction of some kind of a nationalist identity, whereby the underlying source of that identity is the might and the power and the legitimacy of an institution like the military, an inherently colonial institution, an inherently colonizing institution that thrives on things like checkpoints and cantonments and brute force, really, and that's become very clear. And it's been clear for many decades, but especially in the last few years, it has become clear even in the heartland of Punjab now, how that sovereignty is exercised through brute violence, that is always a symptom of the fragility of the state and its sovereignty. So that's the interesting paradox, that that violence is a measure of fragility. And just to be clear, none of what we're saying, Amanullah, is some kind of a glorification or romanticization of any religious actors or the Taliban. You could be critical of many things. You could lodge critiques. So the opposite kind of knee-jerk reaction often tends to be that, okay, you are romanticizing and glamorizing the ulama or the Maulvi sort of class, or the Taliban and so on. And that is not what we're doing. That would be an intellectually lazy and an analytically problematic kind of knee-jerk reaction. What we are calling for is a more keen analysis of why some forms of violence get legitimated and others do not. And that underlying logic has much to do and goes back to this underlying colonial, liberal, secular assumption about the moderation of religion as a phenomenon of life. Until and unless we recognize the intimacy between secularism and colonialism, and how its after effects and shocks are seen even today from both state actors and non-state actors in places like Pakistan, we will not be able to make much analytical progress. And it is on this front that even otherwise very intelligent and sympathetic sort of actors on the left falter, because they are not able to launch a critique of the secular with the same kind of
passion and
energy,
rigor and energy. Yeah,
as they might critique other things like capitalism and class differentials and so on. But any kind of decolonial politics would not be possible without a critique of secular power. And again, a critique of secular power does not mean the glorification or romanticization of any religious actors. It just means being a bit more clear about the workings of secular power in legitimating certain forms of violence, physical or otherwise.
No, I think it's you've very briefly touched on the history of how it operated in Pakistan, and in the last 20-30 years, it was very apparent to some in Pakistan, but in the last 2 to 3 years, it has become abundantly clear to people in Punjab, the Punjabi heartland, of where the bulk of the support for the military apparatus in the state used to come from. That narrative was challenged, and what's funny is that you were arguing about how there is a national glue which holds together the Pakistani narrative, and in both cases, in the case of Imran Khan, there was a significant amount of propping up done by the state before it backfired for them, and also in the case of Musharraf, he was also the one to question the Pakistan state narrative itself. Yani it was in a very ironic sort of way, both acts ended up being unfavorable to the state narrative that was being run, which maintained the illusion of whatever it is to be Pakistani, or whatever it means for Pakistan to exist. Because you had Musharraf questioning the Pakistan ka matlab kya, la ilaha illallah, by saying things like Pakistan first, and we want Turkey style Islam, not Saudi or Afghani style Islam, or something to that effect. He said that, I remember, and the same happened with Imran Khan, where they pushed the anti-corruption narrative to weaken the democratic health of Pakistan, but that ended up being something that became detrimental to their state control, because Imran Khan ended up being somebody who tried to push for civilian supremacy for whatever reason, and you can argue in any which way, and however an individual might support or not like Imran Khan or the PTI. But the point is, it ended up becoming something, which by the way, which is a very funny phenomenon, that nowhere else in the world have I seen Trump mania other than America and in Pakistan, where our liberal intellectual elite have Imran mania, where they start foaming at the mouth at the mere mention of Imran Khan or the mere criticism of Musharraf. And these two phenomena often tend to correlate with each other, where if you find an individual who would find Imran Khan abhorrent, he is very likely to be in love with Musharraf and Musharraf era policies.
Yeah.
Have you dealt with any of our intellectual elite yet, and have you interacted with them since you've moved to America for your studies and for your education and for your career? Have you had interactions with them online or over the phone or physically?
No, thankfully not as much. I mean, because my field is Islamic studies, so usually I sort of talk upon that field. But that field, as you're correctly pointing out through this podcast, is connected to these larger conversations and so on. And you're absolutely right that in some ways, even for, scholars or activists and so on, who otherwise might have very good, political instincts in terms of critiquing the military or critiquing, military operations in Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and so on in the tribal belt. But it's very difficult for them to do so without recourse to a certain kind of a liberal secular framework of analysis. So, in some ways, one of the key ironies of this whole position of, people being, for example, anti-military but pro-drone attacks. I mean, there is this large contingent of people as well who say that, look, drone attacks lead to some unfortunate collateral damage and so on, but it is a very important tool in terms of eradicating terrorists and keeping them away from the sphere of politics and so on. And that's a very kind of dominant kind of narrative among a certain kind of liberal intelligentsia. So the irony there of being anti-military but pro-military violence, that just does not hold. And I think in terms of what you're describing, I mean, I've did an article around 7 years ago called Liberal Fundamentalists and Imranophobia, where precisely what I was interested in was that, of course, you can be critical of him and his politics and his discourse on a number of different issues, in terms of personnel, in terms of framing certain kinds of arguments, whatever political disagreements and critiques that you might have. But I think the kind of this knee-jerk, what you're calling this kind of mania or this phobia, comes from a certain kind of insecurity about this internal other who looks like us, who has a profile of someone, went to Oxford and, was a famous cricketer and so on, but ended up being not like us. It's this underlying kind of way that he cannot be so easily dismissed as, a bearded mullah and so on, who could just be said irrational and so on, but he has this kind of following among the middle class, which also is an interesting phenomenon, the kind of Muslim modernism that he's pushing for, but that's a different topic. But it really comes from, I think, this underlying kind of knee-jerk reaction that, how dare he bring in Islamic themes into politics? Now, again, you can be critical of the whole Riyasat-e-Madina discourse and its contradictions and tensions. So never have I said that one should be uncritically sort of accepting of Imran Khan. And interestingly, I've written some blogs and I did a few kind of podcasts with some friends in the UK, this professor called Salman Sayyid, who actually will be an excellent guest for your podcast as well. So interestingly, the kind of reaction that oftentimes I see is that if you even begin to, analyze this phenomenon of Imranophobia, why this causes this kind of knee-jerk kind of secular reaction, the immediate kind of reaction is that, oh, he's romanticizing and he's just turning into some kind of worshipper of Imran Khan. I mean, this guy in Karachi who heads IBA, what's his name? Akbar Zaidi. So, there is a journal called Critical Pakistan Studies that recently did a special issue on the Imran Khan phenomenon. And, and I was very disappointed to see that because it's a promising new journal for, showing scholarship and new scholarly trends in Pakistan studies and so on. But they basically brought together some very predictable kind of candidates, Akbar Zaidi and Aisha Siddiqa and so on, who do an incredibly lazy and pathetic kind of analysis. And their whole analysis is that, there is this cult following and, all these women are in love with him because of his good looks. And anyone who even begins to analyze the phenomenon is somehow, a sellout or is in love with the person. I think it really comes with this underlying discomfort with bringing in any hint of a political theology, which even has any religious histories. So the interesting thing about this whole Riyasat-e-Madina phenomenon and discourse is that in some ways, the discourse of to follow a Scandinavian model of a welfare state, where you have health insurance, where you treat the dispossessed with justice, with some kind of empathy and so on. But tracing the historical origins of this European welfare state with the state of Madina. It's a very interesting kind of phenomenon. So basically what it is doing is that it is charting a narrative and history of catering to the dispossessed, which does not begin in Europe. So it is basically denying Europe of its own claims to a certain kind of liberalism, right? Now, you can have all kinds of critiques about how it actually gets delivered in terms of execution and some other kind of problems of the discourse. But I think it is precisely that disturbance of the liberal secular desire to locate rationality and politics with a certain European vision of the separation of religion and politics. If someone comes in and disturbs the stability of that narrative, it causes a knee-jerk reaction. And it leads to people saying, oh, he's just a fundamentalist and so on. So, the interesting thing is that even with someone like Imran Khan, who by no means is a Muslim traditionalist, he is by all means a Muslim modernist, an archetypal, in fact, case study for a Muslim modernist, who is coming from a very Western tradition of intellectual training and knowledge and so on, where some kind of Sufism also enters in, but there is no traditional education at work in him. So even if someone like him, who for all practical purposes is a modernist, is so unpalatable to this liberal secular elite, you can only imagine if actually traditionally trained Muslim scholars were to articulate a vision of politics which has an important and significant place for Islam in it. So I think that Imranophobia, that Imran mania on the part of the liberal secular elite, not all critics of Imran, there are some critics who have some very good criticisms as well. The liberal secular kind of knee-jerk phobia, I think, again, comes from a certain kind of liberal secular fundamentalism, where the question is, how dare you disabuse our investment in a secular vision of life where religion can have no place in terms of fashioning some notion of the political, some notion of political justice and so on.
That's something. There's a lot to wrap our heads around, because I think you nailed it completely. That is the annoyance is that you've messed with the paradigm, which is that any notion of a welfare type state has to come. And if Imran Khan has said he was a Keynesian or something, that he believes in public spending and developmentalism, and we have to make bridges and underpasses, and they would respect that. In fact, I think what you're arguing is it doesn't need to be argued, because it's already being seen with the shift from a classical People's Party support base, where you would have from the liberal elite, to the PMLN, which is like conservative of conservatives. It's not even the economics is completely, they liberalized the economy. They've classically run religious narratives, but because they are now shifting their own narratives, they are a convenient scapegoat for this particular elite. You see the liberal elite turning towards the Noon League, and it's really fast. Have you noticed this phenomenon, by the way? How the liberal elite have shifted from People's Party to the PMLN?
No, absolutely. I mean, the way in which the coronation of someone like Mariam was being celebrated as some great achievement of feminism, this whole kind of fascination with PPP as the only political party, mainstream political party that can deliver on the feminist front, as if Judith Butler's next book, the preface, will be written by Sher Ali. I mean, these are dynastic thugs. Let's be very, very clear. And you don't need to be a PTI supporter or a non-critic of Imran to realize that there is a certain kind of a dynastic thuggery which is going on right now in the service of the military elite that is engaging in some forms of violence that usually we're seen in the margins of the country, the tribal areas, Balochistan and so on. So those of us who grew up in Balochistan, the violence of the military is something that is quite palpable in our everyday life, the cantonments and the showing of the ID cards, even if you were from the upper middle class background, which was the case in terms of my family. But this has become much more of a mainland phenomenon, the violence of the military elite. But I just want to add here, Amanullah, a very important point. This phenomenon of a certain kind of attachment to a liberal secular vision of politics is very nicely described by Salman Sayyid, the scholar I just talked about, who is at University of Leeds, as the Kamalist phenomenon. These are basically Pakistani Kamalists. And that is the underlying kind of Kamalism, which I think is personified in the figure of someone like Musharraf, and then seen in different ways by people who are aligned with the intelligentsia. I mean, it really embarrasses me to even use the name Parvez Goodboy with the intelligentsia. His views on religion and Islam are just shockingly pathetic. I should really stick to physics for the rest of his life. But I just want to add one important point here, Amanullah, that in some ways the current political moment of Palestine really sums up the kind of collusion between a liberal secular ideology of the proper place of religion in society, always to be separated from politics, on the one hand, and then the brute exercise of state power in different theaters, Pakistan, India, Palestine, on very different scales and different local dynamics.
Kashmir, and so on and so forth.
Absolutely, Kashmir, absolutely. And they all have this one thing in common. I mean, the idea that a protest for Palestine of Senator Mushtaq and Jamaat Islami would be tear gassed and would become subject to state violence, or raising the name of Palestine and flags of Palestine in a cricket stadium would lead to people being evicted, is a classic demonstration of where the Pakistani elite is headed in terms of its narrative, which is basically this complete absorption of a Kemalist notion of good religion, the kind of MBS model, the Saudi model, whereby progress and economic development and the progress of humanity lies in eclipsing the irrationality, the violence of religious extremism, quote unquote. And even if they pay lip service to Islam, in the case of MBS as being the custodian of the Haramain, in the case of the Pakistani state as somehow being the champion of an Islamic nuclear state, or whatever that might mean at this stage.
They have dropped any notion of that. The pretense has been dropped in Pakistan. In Saudi, right. And I think very fast in Saudi as well, MBS is dropping that pretense and that notion.
Yeah.
Their love affair with Wahhabism or Salafism is over. Our state's love affair with the Deoband and the Ahl Hadith is over. Even the patronage of Barelvi movements like TLP, it's done. It's done and dusted. That was a last ditch effort. Now it's all about reimagining Pakistan. There was an actual, like a series of conferences throughout Pakistan held by certain politicians, one of whom we interviewed recently, by the way. It was called Reimagining Pakistan, and which is the exact title of Hussain Haqqani's book, by the way, Reimagining Pakistan. So this idea of to describe them as Kemalists, I think, is fair, and for them their kryptonite is Musharraf, and we often make the joke that Zia is the Zia of religious people and Musharraf is the Zia of the liberals.
That's nicely put.
And unfortunately, that we have been stuck in this dichotomy of a knee-jerk reaction to the left or a knee-jerk reaction to the right, as opposed to a critical analysis of, as you're saying, of the state's usage of violence and of the state being the arbiter between good religion and bad religion, as the state being the final authority in a society, I would like to add, which is primarily a tribal society. We're not a fully industrialized society even. Our city populations, our urban populations are maybe 20% of the total population of Pakistan. And yet they are dictating on what kind of identity that Pakistan should take up in terms of the next 50 or 100 years that we might have.
No, absolutely. And just to kind of conclude this larger kind of one more specific point rather of Imran Khan, I think whatever the cipher story may have been, whoever might have been behind the regime change operation, whatever the backstory might be, there is no question that a certain kind of implicit or explicit US imperial convenience for having a person like him out of power who might even just raise his voice for Kashmir, whatever contradictions there might be in that, might raise the voice of Palestine in a manner which is more less circumspect than the current lot. Who would talk about, not even discursively, say even in terms of his speech, not in terms of actions, even talk about the idea that there is some kind of Muslim sovereign power of a Muslim nation state that will not bow down to US kind of demands. I think that really typifies, and I think a good kind of parallel, although there are some important differences as well, is the case of Rashid Ghannouchi in Tunisia. So we are seeing a kind of a very interestingly expansive phenomenon right now, from Tunisia to Egypt to Kashmir, India, Pakistan, Palestine, of this underlying state violence against the possibility of some kind of articulation of Muslim politics, some kind of articulation of the political which draws on some sources within Islam. I mean, someone like Ghannouchi, of course, has a very kind of position which is not by any means some kind of a maximalist position of Islam and its foundations for a state. It's very much of a minimalist position in some ways. But even someone like him,
similar to Imran Khan, yes.
Even a modernist like Imran Khan, who's not grounded in some kind of traditionalist knowledge traditions and so on, if even these kinds of figures are so unpalatable, you can only imagine what the case would be if you actually think more seriously about an ummatic vision of the political, which of course will be dismissed by the liberal secular elite. Oh, you're just talking about re-erecting the caliphate and so on, grow up, that time is over. But why should we not raise the question of an ummatic vision of the politics when the liberal secular vision of the political has led to the kind of catastrophic violence, ecological disaster,
No, and
and other.
it's also transnational. The liberal
Yeah,
secular is fully transnational, so why shouldn't we be transnational? When we
right.
have a claim of
Yeah,
over 40, 50 countries through some tenuous even identity of Islam,
yeah,
but it is a
yeah,
collective identity that we have, and in a majority of cases, I say 90% plus cases, it is a contiguous connection that we have. We're physically joined at the hip to other Muslim
right,
countries. So
right,
even any talk of increased economic or trade cooperation is often scoffed at and is looked at as some sort of fantasy, when in that very breath they will argue something implicitly very racist, and which is that we belong to the Gandhara sort of Indus Valley civilization, and so we have to relate and trade and have diplomatic relationships with India. That is such an implicitly racist thing to say to anyone from Balochistan, anyone from Khyber, anyone who has non-geographical or non-Pakistani lineage identities or language roots, for example, Pashto or Dari or any of these identities in Pakistan. And their argument will be that the reason why we need to trade on a... So they'll argue about the global stage, how Pakistan is isolated on the global stage, but that argument will be limited to the Western world. The moment you extend that argument to maybe Central Asia, for example, of having a
right,
relationship with Afghanistan, Uzbekistan,
right,
Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and the like, it will always be
right.
contrived as some sort of demand for caliphate or the Mughal Empire or something.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And this kind of this whole Indus Valley civilization and trying to retrieve that is again a very intensely secular narrative. Basically, what that narrative is something that is pre-Islamic. That's kind of like subtext here. Something that does not, bring the traces of religion in terms of how you think about the political, or this whole idea that Sufis and Sindh are more peace loving and so on, and they can be distinguished from these other ulama or religious types who are not that way. I mean, it's quite remarkable, that I think a lot more of the liberal secular elite in Pakistan were disturbed by the airing of Ertugrul on TV than about the kind of torture and violence and the complete mockery of the rule of law or any notion of civility that has happened in the last few years. And that, I mean, I actually have not seen the Ertugrul thing, so I can't comment on its quality. But basically, that was the underlying kind of anxiety about our quote unquote Indic heritage is being troubled if you bring in these other figures. And it's not even Arab figures at this point. Even Ottoman figures are seen as somehow external, somehow problematic.
Even though
And that
a sizable portion of Pakistan would have Turkmen DNA in them, in
right,
Khyber, they would literally
when
have
you want to go
Turkmen
that up.
DNA. Have you seen these things where like they discuss how Sayyids are false and any Arab lineage is false and Arabism is false and it's a false identity? Again, it's bad science. I'm not going to get into it. I don't want to be quoted as somebody
Right,
who's denying the
right, right,
superiority of genealogy tests that you take when you give your spit in a thing in a cup or something.
right, right.
But it completely ignores any Central Asian or Persian involvement in Khyber, Balochistan, and Punjab, how the language is formed, how the diet has been formed, how the clothes have been, everything from top to the bottom, but to relate it to some sort of vague Indic civilization, which we know barely anything about, by the way, in terms of what is more apparent and real is our relationship with Central Asia than with uh,
And
some historical Indic civilization.
absolutely. And Amanullah, that's exactly what brings together the liberal secular elite in Karachi and Lahore with those in Delhi and Bombay. And that's exactly what brings them together in terms of having some kind of an Indic notion of religion, Indic notion of civilizational exchange, and that's precisely what renders illegible or untranslatable people like Sharjeel Imam in India, who's currently in prison because he raised his voice against the racist laws passed by the Indian, presented by the Indian state, the CAA and the NRC laws since 2020. So I think there is this very interesting kind of collusion that you find among different kinds of activists and all these peace forums and so on, the whole Aman Ki Asha kind of movement. And it also seeps into the academy, into academia. I mean, why is it that many of the Muslim scholars who may not have had a kind of what we might call compatible with liberalism view of Hindu-Muslim relations or interreligious relations. I think of ulama like Maulana Ahmad Raza Khan, the founder of the Bareilly school. He was had very sophisticated arguments for why he found Hindu-Muslim friendship to be troublesome. Now, I'm not trying to advocate his position or deny his position, but why are those kinds of sophisticated Muslim intellectual arguments that don't align with certain liberal secular notions of good religion or good interreligious relations, why are they not given the same kind of airtime, even in the academy, as others?
As
Why
opposed
is
to an
it
Abul
that
Kalam Azad or one of these, yeah.
Absolutely, exactly. So, in my second book, there is a whole 2 chapters on this whole Azad and Ahmad Raza Khan debate, and I try to show the depth, the sophistication, and the tensions of both these scholars. So, I don't want to take one position over the other. But we have to ask, why is it that certain perspectives get left out and others remain? I mean, it's such a big tragedy, Amanullah. Before we started recording, we were talking about, academia and pursuing historical studies, Islamic studies. It's such a tragedy that today in Pakistan, I haven't conducted a survey, but I'm quite sure that 90% of people, not even from the kind of burger elite, but even among the middle class, the upper middle class, who desire to speak English as a form of showing a certain kind of class attachment, 90% of people, I think, would not be able to say even one text of someone as important as Shah Waliullah Rahmatullah, died 1762. In fact, 80% would not even know that name at this point. 90% would not even know that he had a book called Hujjatullah al-Baligha. This, I think, one of the most incredible texts of our South Asian Islamic heritage. And of course, I think 99% would never have even read 5 pages of that. And it's such a tragedy that these important parts of the Islamic heritage of South Asia, which are incredibly sophisticated, which are as complex as any Western theorist, a Rousseau or a Hegel or anyone else, but that is only approached in some kind of select madrasas, even in madrasas, in fact, at this point. Hujjatul al-Balagha is actually not taught with the same kind of rigor that it might have been 100 years ago. So this is a massive intellectual crisis. This liberal secular notion of good, good from good religion and good Muslim also comes notions of good knowledge, useful knowledge. And that's all about, the knowledge of business and, what we were talking about earlier, IR or some science
or medicine or engineering or something.
Engineers. But the death of the humanities or this kind of ventilation, the ventilator that the humanities has been put on, especially the Muslim humanities, is such a tragedy. And it comes from this underlying kind of Kamalist notion of useful knowledge. I mean, what did Ataturk do? Completely transform the Ottoman script, this whole notion that the more you're in line with religious knowledge, the more backward you will be. And that in some ways, the legacy of that we're seeing today, and that in some ways is also a point on which the liberal secular elite, the military elite, and the state elite come together, this notion of useful knowledge. I think it's very interesting that, one of the major reactions that I saw among my own friends and so on, I mean, not friends, acquaintances, I should say, or some distant family and so on, with a certain kind of liberal secular attachment with how they see society and how they see their own role within society. The most visceral reaction that I saw from any of Imran Khan's policies was that whole singular national curriculum thing. And again, you can critique it, whatever it was, who was doing it, is Shafqat Mahmood the right person to do that? You can have all kinds of criticisms. But the underlying anxiety they had was, how dare you suggest that our children who will do O levels and A levels and IB and so on, how dare you suggest that they read similar things as those kids in the madrasa? That was the underlying kind of subtext.
Yeah, it has class underpinnings, it has racial underpinnings, but the overarching umbrella is the idea of the Kamalist, as you said, or the liberal idea of good knowledge versus bad knowledge. That bad knowledge is for all these lesser people, and then the good knowledge is for our kids. That was one of the most violent reactions, by the way. That was.
Absolutely.
And I know people in the private education system, they who are, by the way, making millions for providing mediocre, if not poor quality education. Again, another Musharraf era policy. They're running scared. Yeah.
Yeah, none of this again is to romanticize or give a clean check to madrasa education systems. There can be criticisms, there can be abuses of power, there can be a variety of problems that are being talked about and that are being raised by the ulama themselves. By the way, there are internal critics of that tradition who are deeply sophisticated, but we don't hear about them because they don't make it to the newspapers and the media and the news. Um, but having said that, there can be criticisms of ulama traditions of knowledge of the madaris. I really think that students and especially professors and especially the deans and the presidents of places like IBA, LUMS will really benefit from spending a week in the madrasa, from learning some things about mantiq and its application in Islamic thought, learning something about Shah Waliullah's Hujjatullah al-Baligha. That underlying illiteracy in the religious heritage basically produces these kinds of reactions whereby you have to maintain some kind of a separation between liberal secular knowledge and religious knowledge. And that, unfortunately, even is seen in otherwise very sophisticated, scholars and actors on the left. This use of the word religious extremism, it's such a problematic word, religious extremism. First of all, you are distinguishing between the religious and the political here. Who will decide what is extreme? How do you decide extremism? Whose yardsticks and so on?
No, but
And
that's the thing. It's the arbitrarism. It's all arbitrary. It's a complete appeal to power. All there is an appeal to power and moral arbitrarism. Like, what is the yardstick of measuring the extreme? What is the yardstick of measuring moral or immoral, good or bad? It's completely arbitrary, and the final default authority is the state. There is no tribal overarching umbrella. There cannot be a familial umbrella. There cannot be a religious identity. It has to be the state. And I think the worst manifestation of it is in India, where you have soft Hindutva and hard Hindutva. Hard Hindutva is like BJP and stuff, and soft Hindutva is with the Congress. In fact, liberal commentators on the Pakistani social media scene, a majority of their audience are Hindutva fanatics and IT cell bots from India. A majority of their audience. And they look to them as beacons of light to explain to these savage, and somehow Hindutva narrative makers try to make Hinduism escape that paradigm of religious and try to make it something bigger or different by comparing it to culture as opposed to religion itself, and thus escaping that sort of criticism of bad religion and good religion. So I mean, you see it, and it's a one-sided love affair, unfortunately, I think, from Pakistani social media and liberal intellectuals.
No, absolutely. And you're raising a very important point. I just want to very briefly make 2 points in reaction to that, and then maybe you'll have a final kind of question or so. Just to complete the final kind of mention of the Imran Khan phobia, my underlying, one can be very critical of him about many matters, but my underlying kind of consideration of his politics, and in some ways admiration, comes from the stance against the war on terror. At a time when it was very convenient to, condemn bombings and violence and so on, or to talk about, the Taliban as the most gruesome thing that has ever happened to, South Asia. He did raise his voice about this collusion precisely between the American imperial state and the Pakistani military elite. And unfortunately, that kind of critique that he had of the military elite kind of went to the wayside when he got into power. And that is something that should be intensely critical of him about. But at least he had that position of not doing the convenient thing of just condemning bombings and so on and playing the liberal secular game of authorizing military interventions to stamp out quote unquote religious extremists. But he took that position of connecting that violence. And the second thing that, even though he's a Muslim modernist and, might have his own critiques of the religious elite, at least he did not engage in the same kind of dehumanization of the madrasas and the occupants of the madrasas as you see from some of these other liberal secular politicians and activists. Someone like his Reimagining Pakistan guy, Mifta Ismail, he goes to New York and he's sitting with these, white people, New York or DC, and he says that, we have this opponent of ours, Imran Khan, he talks about Amr bil Ma'roof and Nahi anil Munkar, enjoining the good and forbidding the wrong. And this is like the Taliban. The Taliban also have the same kind of slogan, and this basically is our local Taliban because he talks about Amr bil Ma'roof and Nahi anil Munkar. Basically, you have a brown guy wanting the approval of the white man by playing the liberal
full support, sir. We don't want Amr bil Ma'roof, sir. No, it's very unfortunate. That's exactly what it is. It's like this. It's the brown man complex, and Imran Khan was labeled, if you remember, the Taliban Khan. when he
No,
opposed drone
absolutely.
strikes. And a lot of, by the way, Pashtun nationalists and liberals forget that he was one of the ones. Even in the Pashtun belt, you find a lot of liberals forget, because we have a rich tradition of the left in Khyber as well, in Pashtun communities as well. They forget that he was somebody opposed to dehumanizing Pashtun people,
Yeah.
dehumanizing the religious students. In a majority of them came from Khyber Pakhtunkhwa by at that time. Um,
Right.
and in fact, this is a gripe that they still hold against him. This is a gripe that they still hold against him to this day. They still
Right.
call him Taliban Khan. And we interviewed Hakan Abbasi, who is from my area, from my belt. I'm from the Potohar.
Uh-huh.
So he's
Uh-huh.
more of a conservative style Uncle G, like, oh, business and trade, and that's what we need to do.
Right.
But they are part of that sort of greater narrative about how we need to get away from the Taliban and Taliban style Islam. We need to create our own Indic version of Islam that works as good religion.
And the point, Amanullah, here is not to work in this kind of a binary that either you have to accept everything that the Taliban says or you have to have this Western liberals. There's a big space in the middle. Right? So being critical of this liberal secular discourse by no means that you are endorsing the Taliban's position on education and so on, and that you're uncritically accepting them. These are not the only two options. Again, the plea that I'm making is of some kind of analytical nuance. And last thing I would say on this topic, and then I want to speak a little about the other point you raised about India and this kind of the pro soft Hindutva and the anti bad Hindutva thing. I think that's also a very important topic. But the last thing I want to say on this is that, again, and this I'm speaking primarily as an academic based in the US, but I come back to Pakistan pretty much every year. But as a Pathan academic from Balochistan, from the Kashmir district, that you cannot again engage in a politics which is critical of the military and raises one's your voice for dispossessed populations like the Pathans and the Baloch and so on, without critiquing American imperialism. That is the mother of all sources of corruption, right? That's the kind of terminology of Islamic knowledge, because that's the asl of the corruption, the moral political corruption, because that in
It's
some
also a
ways.
financial, by the way, Sher Ali Saab. It was also a
Yeah.
financial corruption, because our NGO classes, our social advocacy classes, our civil society class was paid off via the NGO USAID trickle down effect to basically be quiet about American imperialism, but to challenge the Pakistani state about missing persons and about women and their sexual hygiene and blah blah blah. So they were given token issues to play around with as a cudgel to morally judge the Pakistani state and to browbeat the religious community of Pakistan, but never to question the master that feeds them, the hand that feeds them. Never to bite back at the actual American imperialism. And there is a Maulana Sahib here. He is an ex a member of the of Dr. Star's Jamaat of Tanzim Islami, and he has his own smaller movement now. He felt that it was not as pure. You know what happens with tahriks. They keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and they keep dividing it. But he's ustad of mine, a good friend, and I would like to think he's a good friend. He says that Khalid Mahmood Abbasi, that's his name. He says that the religious types in Pakistan are made fools out of by giving them Kalashnikovs, and the secular types are made fools out of by giving them dollars. That was the game with the state, a radicalization of dollars and rifles, for both the left and the right.
No, and sort of just to complete this thought that, to show Pathan solidarity, it cannot come from a certain kind of an NGOization of the discourse that, we will only show solidarity towards those Pathans who are explicitly secular or have a certain kind of attachment to a secular notion of keeping religion out of politics. And, even within a movement like the PTM, and, its demands, of course, are very fair in terms of the checkpoints and erasing them and the kind of what do you call them?
Harassment policies and checks and balances.
Explosives under the ground. I'm forgetting the English word for that.
The IDs, the
IDs, exactly, removing them. They're very, very fair points. But when you begin to then publish op-eds in the Guardian and the New York Times, which are very critical of the military, and correctly so, but then don't even mention the American empire, which clearly the New York Times is using you as a instrument to play its own game about otherizing the religious fanatic. That does not cut. Or when you make a distinction between the good Pathan is the one who is all into Marxist literature and socialism,
Bacha
and then you have
Khanisms
the bad
and
Pathan,
yeah.
the bad Pathan who could either be supportive of Imran Khan or who is
You mean
attracted to the idea
Gul
of
Khan?
Riyasat Madina, or could be from the religious class and follows
You mean
Maulana
Gul
Fazlur Rahman,
Khans?
whatever.
They have a name
Again,
for
not
them. You know that they have a name for them. They call them Gul Khans.
right, exactly. So that solidarity will not work. Again, I'm just pushing for this idea
It's not
that
morally consistent. It's not morally consistent.
right,
Generally, it's not.
exactly.
It's. And by the way, I would like to point out that young people now can see the disingenuity. Not a majority of
Yeah.
them, but a lot of young
Exactly.
people can see the disingenuity between distinguishing between a certain kind of Pathan or a certain kind of Pakistani on a broader scale. The
Yeah.
NGOization of Pakistan. I really feel like they should be like scholars like you have to write full theses about the NGOization of the Pakistani discourse. And
Yeah.
it's a very ridiculous. There are camps, and this is a certain kind of person, and they deserve representation, but this kind of person does not. And
Yeah.
you saw that especially now, even in Punjab and in Sindh, with the PTI phenomenon and post 9th May, you would not get people volunteering to pro bono be lawyers for people who are political prisoners under the PTI or PTI members who are political prisoners. You would not get people protesting on the street for PTI members in jail, or even for the TLP, by the way. I think
Right.
this otherization should not even be done for the TLP, because as ridiculous as this notion sounds, is that TLP is from among the people. It is not from the state.
Right.
As much as the
Right.
initial catalyst was a state catalyst, they are representative of a certain kind of class of people, and it's not only immoral, it's undemocratic, to be fair. It's genuinely undemocratic, the attitudes that the liberal elite have.
No, absolutely. And these places like HRCP, etc., the decibel of their stridentness in terms of which voices they raise their own voice for and which voices they don't, is, I think, maps onto a liberal secular grid of which humans are more worthy of solidarity and which ones are not. And that is the underlying liberal secular attitude and kind of inbuilt assumption that you see at play there. Coming just to as a sort of final sort of to round up this discussion, what you talked about India, I think that's a very, very important theme as well, because one of the other things that is happening, other than the marginalization of Palestine, is the marginalization of Kashmir in the political discourse. And the irony of this whole notion of a good liberal secular, Congress is India, and then the bad Hindutva BJP is India. And this, of course, is something that especially our Kashmiri friends from Indian occupied Kashmir, academics and activists, people like this amazing young scholar that you must know about, my brother Ahmed
Qasim, yeah.
Ahmed Qasim, or scholars like Mr. Hafsa Kanjbal and other people have raised.
Brother, do you know about Muzammil Ayub Thakur?
Oh, of course, yeah. Exactly. That this, when we bifurcate India into this, good liberal secular Nehruvian India and then bad BJP India, we are basically, again, not taking into consideration the violence of the Indian state, which has been going on for decades against populations like Kashmir, against the whole idea.
Against Punjabis. Against Punjabis.
Exactly. And again, the whole idea here is that this attachment to
against Marxist Naxalites, by the way.
Yeah.
Against actual Marxists and leftists as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there is this underlying attachment that you have among large sorts of secular kind of populations, and even in the academy, for example. Even in the academy,
do you know that in India, even the Rediwala, even his payments are digitized? Do you know that?
Yeah.
Do you know you can't buy a Golgappa without using a Bill Gates style tracker app? Beta. You have to think about. Can you believe that there are economists running around Pakistan like beating their chest for the Indian economic model of growth?
Right. No, and even unfortunately, even among some of the religious scholars, because that's sort of the main group of people that I stay in touch with. Even there, you have these narratives of, if you go to the border, the Pakistani Kashmir is so underdeveloped, the other side is so developed. That's a really, really unfortunate kind of phenomenon.
Developmentalism is always a fallback, by the way, to explain away anything.
Absolutely. Which doesn't take into account that the otherization of Islam and Muslims, which is central to the occupation of Kashmir, has been a long-running phenomenon of Indian politics and Indian political thought. And, when we do this kind of a sort of a more intellectually refined form of Aman Ki Asha, with your Indian and Pakistani scholars who are trying to imagine a world, that will have no borders, and how, there will be a cricket team in which there will be both Kapil Dev and Imran Khan, this kind of fascinations and fantasies of this kind of, an Indo-Pak utopia. What they are undermining is the violence of their respective nation states. And that violence, again, comes from a certain kind of internalization of a secular form of power that can also be exercised by Hindu nationalists. So that's a very important point, Amanullah, that this, what we're calling secular power, is not only applicable to actors and political kind of elite that are avowedly secular. Even if they are calling themselves Hindu nationalist or Hindutva, it is folded into a certain secular regulation of populations that leads to phenomenon like a young, brilliant man like Sharjeel Imam being in jail, and other kind of liberal secular Muslims being heralded as the epitome of Indian secularism. I mean, the irony, one thing I also said to Ahmed bin Qasim in a podcast we did a couple of years ago, the irony that a person like Dilip Kumar, who is oftentimes championed as this great representation of, the Hindustan, this is the other kind of trope which has become very popular among academics, that you have the Hindustan that used to be marked by porous boundaries, and then came colonialism and nationalism that has eviscerated the promise of Hindustan. But someone like Dilip Kumar, who's oftentimes heralded as this kind of emblem of that phenomenon, here you have a Muslim guy with the name Yusuf Khan, who literally had to change his name to gain any kind of acceptability in the Indian public sphere. And you're championing him as some kind of phenomenon or some kind of emblem of,
I think the new version of the Dilip Kumar trope is now embodied in Shah Rukh Khan, and you saw it with all of his films and how they were attacked by Hindutva and the extreme sort of state apparatus that went against him, because this again Muslim Pashtun guy, Pathan guy, and he's embodying this all-encompassing Hindustan and this very porous and open culture. But the moment he does not toe the Acha Musalman, Bura Musalman, good Muslim, bad Muslim narrative, they can tank his sales and try to attack him in any way they can.
No, absolutely. And there is a guy who goes out of his way trying to show secular credentials. I'm married to a Hindu woman. I do all these films which are about feeling good about, the Indian nation state. But even he's so vulnerable, you can only imagine what the status might be. So, I just want to end with the plea that at varied levels, you have the NGO level, you have the state level, you have the level of these, pink fests and these, what do you call that, fairs, festivals, where you know. And,
do you know what Nadeem Pracha said at one of these festivals recently? He said that the state should have the ability to take over if a Hitlerian character is elected to power.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair mongering. I would not expect anything
less from the great Nadeem Pracha.
More nuance from an idiot like him. But
I actually wanted to ask you a very serious question, by the way, in closing.
Sure.
Do you know that the PI used to serve alcohol?
Excuse me?
Do you know the PI used to serve alcohol?
It used to serve alcohol.
Yes. And the women in Karachi used to wear skirts.
Oh, it used to be this great, much like that.
In the 60s. The Beatles came to Pakistan. Do you want to know the most messed up iteration of this kind of liberal sort of appeal to like rosy tinted glasses about the 60s? Bajwa, the chief army staff, in his sort of victory tour at the end, went to Lums for a talk. And you know what he said there? When I was a young boy, I remember in the 60s, the Beatles came to Pakistan. And I felt like everything had come full circle, that an actual army chief has to appeal to little children by telling them how Pakistan was very cool back in the day and we can be cool again.
Yeah, and didn't he also say that to the Americans that I don't even like Chinese food? And, what else would you expect from someone who was enamored by a dim-wit figure like Bilawal, who really whose crowning achievement in life is the collision of parental chromosomes, but somehow he's a political figure taken seriously. But, just to end on this point of why a podcast like yours is so important, Amanullah. And it is not to be polemical, by the way. And of course, we will be dismissed by saying, they're just being polemical.
No.
And so on. But the importance here is precisely that this kind of liberal secular power, right, operates at multiple levels. You have the state level, you have the NGO level, you have the think fest and the kind of liberal intelligentsia, the op-eds in Dawn and so on. But then it also operates in more sophisticated ways, even in the academy. When we try to make a case for excavating some kind of a lost Hindustan from the rubbles of colonial power, which is not attentive to the secular violence against religion and religious subjects. When we engage in this kind of a practice of not taking seriously Muslim scholars and Muslim intellectual traditions that don't align nicely with liberal secular notions of the good Muslim. When we do these kinds of things, or when we nostalgically try to remember and yearn for a Nehruvian secularism, which is enshrined in the Indian constitution, which is something which is done constantly by Indian and Pakistani academics, this kind of a collusion of what I would like to call the Lahore and Karachi and then the Bombay and Delhi Gymkhanas, right? So these kind of elite academics, Brahmin or others, who come together and they're very good,
No, I'm a member. Please don't disparage Gymkhana like that. I go swim sometimes at the Gymkhana. I happen to have, my family happens to have climbed all the way to the bottom rungs of that particular segment of society. So I take umbrage to your comments about the Gymkhana, and you will not be allowed to enter our lawns and eat the chicken, the bland mayonnaise chicken sandwiches that we have on offer.
Yeah, I'm never dressed as well, anyways, to enter those places. But to really, academics would be very good about criticizing the military, or on that side, about criticizing Hindutva, but they would not venture into these other kind of ways or the exclusions and the violence. And again, the point is not to glorify any religious actor.
Hey, speak for yourself.
Repeatedly, right? But I think these kinds of media are especially important so that the public sphere is wrested away, or at least there will be competing voice.
Inshallah. And throughout this podcast, the only thought I was getting was, holy heck, this should have been all in Urdu.
Well, inshallah, we can do another one in Urdu.
Inshallah.
But that chasm between a certain kind of a liberal secular fundamentalist and a certain, kind of opposing camp, which also does its own kind of unfair criticisms. But of course, the liberal secular crowd gets a lot more airtime in the larger kind of court of the global public opinion, because
even in the local, they have all these corporates to prop them up. Their music with Coke Studio, and their music with Unilever's Nescafe basement, or Nestle's whatever, or Cornetto Studio, or they have their TV channels to patronize them. I mean, they have even the literal watchdog for Facebook. The official watchdog is Nigatad, officially, by the way, and her organization, which are paid millions of dollars, by the way, to operate an NGO that secures the digital rights of Pakistani citizens. We have had multiple pages struck down on Facebook, on YouTube as a platform. We could never approach the Digital Rights Foundation, because the moment they would see our grinning silly faces, they would realize that we are Maulvis or whatever, or we are trying to critique their vision of a good secular Pakistan. So yeah, I mean, it's an uphill battle, and we are all you have. It's us and a couple of other guys.
I mean, my sort of, I think, closing thought here would be, especially for the young people who are watching this, there is a tremendous depth and sophistication in the Islamic intellectual tradition, which unfortunately does not make it to the curricula. And unfortunately, even when it comes to Islamic bookstores, increasingly it has become less and less available, this kind of the tradition of Islam, especially in South Asia. And developing some kind of a basic literacy and competence. I'm not saying that everyone should become religious scholars or just become humanities scholars, but having some basic literacy, some basic sense of the nuance of that tradition is important, precisely so that we can more critically approach these kinds of implicit or explicit forms of liberal secular bias and violence that we see pervading different aspects and different parts of society in Pakistan and also globally. And the last thing, of course, I would end with a prayer of peace and justice for the people of Palestine and Kashmir, and a prayer that all of the supporters, the abettors, and the instigators of the ongoing genocide of the Israeli nation state against Palestine may they taste every form of suffering, both in this world and the next. May God account for them
Ameen.
appropriately.
Ameen.
Amen.
Sher Ali Saab, thank you for your time. And I think
Thank you, Manullah bhai. Thank you, Saad bhai. Thank you so much.